Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining what everyone's favorite piece of programs are grower panels, and that's exactly what we have here today. My name's Steve Coleman. I'm an associate professor at Washington State University based in Pullman. I'm relatively new here, just 6 months in the saddle, and excited to talk to some growers here. We've kind of selected a wide variety of different cropping systems and perspectives, and lots of experience. So to kind of help with the conversation today. So I'm going to start with the obvious and just ask for some introductions. I'll let you all maybe talk for about, say, 3 or 5 minutes, just kind of introducing yourself and your operation, and maybe where in the state you're at, and anything else that you think is kind of important or unique about your farm. So maybe we can start with you, Brad. Do you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Yeah. So I farm in Connell, Washington, which if you've ever driven from the Tri-Cities to Ritzville and then on to Spokane on Highway 395, you go right by Connell. It's about halfway between Tri-Cities and Ritzville. So that gives you an idea of where I'm located. So yeah, like I've said before, I'm actually on the land. I'm a 5th generation of our family farming. It started out as a dryland wheat farm and was a dryland wheat farm all the way through the mid 80s, and continued to be dryland wheat, except we put it all in CRP in the mid 80s. And so from the mid 80s to the late 90s, it was in the Conservation Reserve Program, just planted to grasses. And then in the late 90s, we started taking it out of CRP little by little, and transitioned it to organic immediately. So that's how I got into organic, was taking ground out of CRP. And so that was 2003 when I took over, back from college and back from some overseas travel. And then I decided to farm it organically, like I said. So yeah, since 2003, I've been growing just a lot of different organic crops and doing a lot of cover cropping. And that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
So Brad, tell us a little bit more about like what kind of crops you're growing, and maybe a little bit of the rotation or whatever you might employ.
Yeah. So I started out growing potatoes, onions, and some vegetable seed crop. Like I grew carrots, but for seed. I've grown squash, spinach. I grow a lot of ancient grains, but right now, peas for processing, onions, and ancient grains, along with the cover cropping.
Great. And is it all certified organic?
Yes.
Your operation? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It's like, well, I have 700 acres at this point, certified with WSDA, and I'm going to be getting water from the Columbia River. And so I'll be able to actually up my acreage to almost 1,300, and I'll have full water on all 1,300 acres. And I'm going to be 100% organic also. The ground that I'm putting the water on had been in dryland wheat production, but I bought it a couple falls ago, and I'm transitioning it to organic right now.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Brad. Hang tight. We'll get back to you in a little bit here. Darren, do you want to go next and just tell us a little bit about you and your operation?
Yeah, you bet, Steve. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's an interesting group of people, very diverse, and I look forward to all the discussions. Darren Morrison. I live in Mount Vernon, Washington. It's the northwestern part of Western Washington. It's a river delta fed by the Skagit River. We're at sea level, and we are primarily potato growers. We farm about 1,100 acres with a potato focus on fresh market potatoes, all conventional at this point. And so we tell people that we actually grow more crops. Most of our crops is not potatoes. So our rotation involves cereal grains like winter wheat, some spring barley, and grass seed that we grow, some perennial ryegrass, and some tall fescue. And then we also are part of a pretty important area here that grows small seed vegetable crops like spinach and table beet and cabbage. And it's kind of one of the only places in the world. Well, it's not the only place in the world, but it's a very unique place, especially in North America, that doesn't get too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. It has the right day lengths to produce some of the vegetable seeds. So that's always been a part of our operation. So very diverse crop farms, what we do with a maritime climate, which is unusual for a lot of folks that are used to agriculture in Washington, and then being at sea level. The good news is we have plenty of rain, sometimes too much. And then also our soil type. It's alluvial soil that was deposited here over thousands of years from lahars and floods and glaciers and all that kind of thing. So it's a very rich soil, and we're very blessed to be farming some of it. So that's kind of our farm's been in, I'm a fourth generation, and it's been in our family for over 100 years. We started looking at soil health and, just trying to keep sustainability, keep us here on the land. It was important to take a look at cover crops and rotations for pest control and things of that nature. We do dabble a little bit in organics. I have 25 acres certified organic that we raise malting barley for one of the local, kind of a hyper local market here in Western Washington. So that's something new and kind of a budding industry for us. And I think that's about it for me right now.
That's great. All right. Well, thanks, Darren. Doug, do you mind going next?
Douglas Poole from Mansfield, Washington. We farm in the North Douglas County area, which would be the easiest way if you were looking at a map and happened to drive through Bridgeport on to Brewster and then on around the corner over to Pateros and head south back to Wenatchee or Chelan. We farm up on top of that hill as you look south. So all dry land. I'm jealous of everybody else on the panel. Looks like you got a little bit of water. God's helping us out here a little bit this year. I'm sitting looking out the window right now at just under 2 feet of snow, which we haven't seen in about 4 or 5 years. So we're pretty excited this year. Our operation is a dry land small grains. And so obviously primarily is wheat. Interestingly enough, my farm in the last 4 years has been more canola than wheat. So we have canola, wheat, we've done oats, sunflowers, triticale, been playing with some peas for cover crops to keep our own seeds, sorghum, had a real successful trial with millet this last year. Started introducing cover crops in 2013. A lot of that was through the CSP program through NRCS. We struggled to see the fit of the cover crops here in this dry land. And again, when I say dry, 6 to 8 or maybe 9 inches a year. And so the back of the cover crops, we were struggling to see how they fit until one day we were doing a trial and the cows got out and we figured out that maybe we ought to be grazing those. And so 17, we've integrated the cattle to the cover crops and began to rotate basically the cover crops through the system, eliminating the cash crop for the year and just turning it over basically to a soil remediation with the covers and the cattle. So that kind of sums up where we're at.
That's great. Awesome. Thanks, Doug. And Patrick, do you want to round us off?
Yes, good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you, guys. So I'm Patrick Ron, with Two Mountain Winery and Vineyards in the Yakima Valley. So we're in the west end of the Yakima Valley. We operate about 400 acres, a little less than 400 acres of wine grapes. So all irrigated off of the Rosa and Deepwater wells, also exceedingly dry, similar amounts of precipitation to sounds like what Doug gets. We get about 6 inches of precipitation annually. So without our irrigation, we wouldn't be able to grow very much. So yeah, all of our acres are certified sustainable through rules for sustainable wine growing out of California, as well as the brand new Sustainable Washington certification. So we've been moving this direction and really thinking about our farming practices and kind of the why behind a lot of what we're doing, and trying to connect the dots between kind of plant health and plant resiliency and soil and this kind of journey for our sustainability certification over the last 7 or 8 years, and then became certified this will be our fourth year fully sustainably certified. And now those wines are in the market as well, which is exciting to see. So.
That's great. Okay. Thanks, Patrick. So, well, of course, we're here for SoilCon, and so it's all things soil. That's what we're here to talk about. And it's great to see the kind of the diversity of growers and just operations here. And then hopefully, maybe some different perspectives because of that. So I guess we'll start off with just thinking about soil management and challenges that you face on your operations. And I'm wondering if, again, with the diverse climates that we have represented on the panel, if we can just go around the horn and talk about, if you can just share with us like one or maybe two of the challenging pieces that you have in terms of soil management. What are like the dilemmas that you really face in terms of dealing with some of the soil management issues?
Okay, well, I can start. Back in the western side of the state, lots of rainfall. Someone mentioned 6 inch, I think it was Doug. 4 to 6 inches, that's what happens in a week here sometimes. But the challenges for a guy in Western Washington trying to farm heavy soil, rich, silty, loam type soil in 30 inches of annual rainfall, which is mostly in the winter time, but it's just wet. Cool climate, wet soils, trying to keep those soils from getting too much compaction. That's been one of our focuses with things like cover crops and just the way we manage our soil. And then a short season. So a lot of times we're finishing up harvest in October and the weather's starting to change to a cooler, wetter season, and it's hard to get cover crops or winter cereal or something started in a reasonable fashion. So those are the two main challenges I think we face over here.
Who else wants to jump in? Doug, I think you've got some things you might want to talk about.
I imagine it's perceived that I've got a long list, but we're starting to actually dawn on us that we've actually got a pretty good gem here. With the 6 to 8 inches of rain, we've got shallow soils. Again, if you ever had a chance to look at the map, the Missoula flood decided to drop all its rocks here. And I farm about 8 miles from where that stopped. Central Washington, WSU, and UW spent a lot of time in their little white vans checking out where the glacier stopped. So that's always fun. And so with that, I've got some pretty shallow soils, and the water can't get away from me. And so we implemented no-till 10 years ago. And probably our biggest barriers right now is that some of that soil is gone. And so there's a lot of fields that we just don't farm anymore, or getting to that point, a lot of areas of the field, a lot of salinity. So years and years of tillage, and then years and years of anhydrous ammonia fertilizer placed at 4 inches. And so when you talk about compaction, it kind of falls, everybody kind of raises an eyebrow. I don't believe we really have a compaction issue here, besides what the glacier caused. I think we have an anhydrous pan. And so trying to break those past practices. And again, I think it's important to point out, those were the best practices we had. And the farm I happened to implement it, every one of my landlords did a very, very good job. But those are just things we're learning that, 10 years later, after I kind of took over the farm, we're learning that probably the anhydrous is probably one of the bigger things that is posing the barrier. And again, I think probably all of us face compaction. I'm glad you already mentioned it, Darren. So those would be a couple of the things that, again, I'm sure everybody thought it was going to be rain, but it really isn't. It is the compaction and just the general quality of the soil after all these years of those practices.
Great. Thank you. Who's next?
I would say my main challenges at this point, I don't think I mentioned it in the introduction, but I'm pumping water from a deep well, or from 2 different deep wells. So, I mean, I'm glad that I have that water and that water right, but the fact of the matter is it's not that great of water. It's got a lot of bicarbonate, a lot of sodium, and that causes some pretty significant water infiltration issues and some nutrient tie-up. High pH, that my pHs are in the low 8s generally, and that just makes it hard. So the fact that I'm always putting high sodium water onto my crops, I'm kind of going in the wrong direction as far as soil health goes. Like I mentioned before, though, luckily I'll be getting water from the Columbia River, which will not have all that sodium or bicarbonate. So when that happens, I think I'll be able to start improving the situation with water infiltration. And I'm still going to have to remediate some of the past damage from all of that high sodium water, but at least I'll have the opportunity to do that. And we don't get enough rainfall. We're also in the 6 to 8 inch rainfall zone, so we don't get enough winter moisture to really flush the sodium out of the upper soil profile. So we're always dealing with that soil sealing on the surface. And so for in the onions, I've gone to drip irrigation, and that helps a lot because it's a really slow application rate. But with the center pivots, it's a fairly fast application rate, even if we have low output sprinkler packages on. The water still tends to run off, so it's hard to keep it in the field where we want it. So that, I'd say that's probably my biggest challenge, is the water quality and quantity, because the aquifer is declining, and that's exactly why they're trying to get guys like me off of the aquifer and onto the Columbia River water, because of the fact that the water's disappearing. Talk about the glacial times, all that water that we're pumping is ice age water. It's water that's been trapped down there for a long time, so it's absorbed a lot of minerals.
So that's pretty interesting, Brad. We're gonna have to revisit you in about 3 or 5 years from now and see what changes, if you can. I mean, it's kind of a pretty fascinating natural experiment if you think about it, right? Just changing that water source might have really profound differences in the soil and the way it functions, and even the health of it. So
yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be a fun process.
Curious to revisit that. So yeah, awesome. Okay, thanks for that, Brad. Patrick, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, at least top of my list right now, I mean, I think what we're concerned about is always, we have a problem and we sort of solve for it and then we move on to the next problem. But the thing that we, as our process and philosophies has really shifted here in the last decade or so. The kind of challenge that we're thinking, or the thing we're addressing or trying to think about now, is thinking about, how do we establish cover crops in the middles between the vine rows? So everything for us on a vineyard is drip irrigation. We're using very little amounts of water. We're really good at managing soil health and building soil biodiversity in the vine row itself. But in the middles, where we don't have any water and we get less than 6 inches of precipitation, how do we establish a cover crop? How do we establish soil health? How do we work on soil health in those middles? And what can we do to build soil health, not just in the vine row, but across the entirety of that particular property? And so that's kind of the top of our list of things we're solving for right now, from the vineyard side of it.
Great. Wow. Very different challenges, different perspectives. It's good to hear all this. Okay. So, well, that's helpful just to put it a little bit in context for us to see, where you folks are coming from. So one of the themes in SoilCon this year is talking about carbon. This is not, probably as a perennial theme, but we're certainly interested in that as kind of a primary feature and function of soil health. And there's a lot to say about carbon, of course. We can think of it in the context of organic matter. We can think of it, in the context of what is maybe the hot button topic of our day, thinking about carbon trading and, the role that ag can play in mitigating atmospheric carbon loading. And so I think that, it's unclear to me how much you all think about, from this framework about like managing carbon. How do you manage carbon? I think maybe organic matter is, just of course, something that's a fundamental tenet in terms of good management. But I'll ask the general question is, what are your goals for managing soil carbon on your operation? are you like, what are the maybe an easier way to think about that is like, what are the practices that you're doing to try to increase carbon or increase organic matter? You know, whether that is building it, keeping soil covered, keeping it on your field. What are the primary things that you worry about or really try to manage for?
You know, thinking about soil carbon, we've always thought about it the last, you know, really a couple of years, probably less than that. We've really thought about it from an organic matter perspective. And now we're really connecting the dots and be like, oh, this is carbon, and kind of broadening that thought process. And in that, you know, we're always trying to build. We've got very thin, not very much soil, and very thin soil of what we have. So most of our vineyards, and we're very purposely planting our vineyards on the worst piece of ground that we can find. The more rocks, the least soil, the better. The challenge for growing wine grapes, you guys are probably all aware, is controlling vigor. Vines are very resilient plants, and they're very vigorous. And so how we can drive wine quality is primarily through controlling vine vigor. So planting in the driest possible place with the worst possible soil is very helpful for that. But we still need to then in that, we need to try to build back that organic matter in the soil. And how do we do that? And we've historically done that through using compost applications in the vine row. But kind of our newest shift here in the last 3 years is we've transitioned to what we reference as a floor to floor cover. So no longer are we stopped using herbicide on our farm maybe 7-8 years ago. And we were mechanically tilling in the vine row to manage the weeds. And we've gone completely away from even mechanically tilling that. And we're letting it floor to floor cover. We're trying to figure out how to establish particular cover crops. We think we can do some cool things if we can figure out how to seed in that 18-inch strip underneath the vine row. We have not solved for that yet. It's a bigger challenge, mechanical challenge. You know, most of our vineyards are increasingly higher and higher density on 6 and 7 foot rows and 3 and 4 foot plant spacings. So finding mechanical ways to seed that, but we're really just gone to taking whatever will grow in the vine row, and what we used to think about as weeds, now we think about as really valuable cover crop, and really finding it's reducing the soil temperatures during the peak of the summer and the heat of the day, and really helping build that biodiversity and building that biome within the soil. And so that's kind of where we're going on carbon, and connecting it back to kind of connecting soil, connecting that to kind of the carbon, thinking about carbon, and from that perspective.
That's great. Awesome. Great examples. Thanks, Patrick. Brad, how about you? Do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, you know, before we were recording, I mentioned that the topic of soil carbon is kind of new for me. I didn't really use the word carbon when I talked about my farm. I cover cropped a lot, and I always have. Like I said, from 2003 on, I've grown a lot of hairy vetch and triticale together as kind of the main source of nitrogen for my cash crops. So I will always take a field anytime I'm going to grow onions or potatoes. I've got a year and a half of cover cropping ahead of that. So I'll do the vetch and triticale. I'll follow that with mustard to kind of recycle the nutrients. And then I'll generally grow the crop then without any additional nitrogen, or if there is any additional nitrogen, it'll be like a foliar or at planting, like a planter band type of thing. But really the crops do fine with just the amount of nitrogen that was gathered during that cover cropping cycle. So I've always thought in terms of just organic matter, not so much carbon, but definitely if you go on the internet, everybody's talking about carbon. So at some point, maybe I'll have to get tuned into the carbon thing, and maybe I'll get paid for all this cover cropping I'm doing. But at this point, I just think in terms of agronomics, and the best way to grow a crop in my mind is to grow your own nitrogen. Obviously crops need a lot of nitrogen. So I don't bring in a lot of off-farm inputs as far as fertilizers go. I've gone away from using compost, and sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't have gone away from using compost, but it's so hard to find good compost, and a lot of times you're importing problems. So if you can avoid importing, it could be like heavy metals, it could be pesticide or herbicide residues, or it could be weed seeds if they're not doing a good job of composting. So I've been pretty leery of trucking in tons of compost onto my farm. I just try to grow the nitrogen, and then my crop rotation lends itself. I have peas in my rotation, so I don't need to bring in nitrogen for those. And then ancient grains work really well because they don't use a lot of nitrogen. Like, they're very good at scavenging for nutrients. So I feel like my rotation lends itself to kind of lower input farming, even though I'm growing some crops like onions that require a lot of inputs. But it's amazing what crop of onions you can grow on just a cover crop for your nitrogen source and not having to bring in nitrogen from somewhere else.
As I'm listening, and I have questions for everybody, so I don't know if we'll get a chance to ask each other
Yeah,
questions.
if I'm kind of facilitating here, but let's if you want to jump in, anyone wants to jump in and ask follow-ups, please do. Yeah, go right ahead.
Real quick for Brad, are you roller crimping some of that, or how are you taking that cover crop down?
That's a good question. I've done everything. I used to just mow it and disc it like 3 times, because when I grow a cover crop, it's a massive cover crop. It's like, 7 feet tall cover crop. And that's why I grow the triticale with the vetch, because it just allows something for that vetch to climb up. So it does get to be a huge amount of above ground biomass. And in the past, I struggled to get all of that biomass down into the ground, because I thought that was where it needed to be, like punched down into the ground where the microbes could work on it and be a food source for the microbes. But now there's so much anti-tillage talk out there. Like, tillage is terrible for a lot of people, and I'm still on the fence. Like, I'm not so sure tillage is terrible, but I know that soil health probably means reducing tillage, but I don't know how that all comes together. And so, yeah, I've roller crimped it. The problem that I've had is to roller crimp such a big, heavy crop is hard to kill it. And I've had it grow back. The vetch didn't die, and it started to make seed on me. And then you got a problem for the next several years of volunteer vetch. So you've got to be sure you can kill it with that pass. And I haven't found a roller crimper that'll kill that yet. And so, yes, I've tried it, but my go-to is a spader. So it's a big, slow moving it's not a rototiller, because it's not a fast moving. Like, it takes your 1,000 RPM out of the back of the tractor and reduces it down to 200 RPM. So I use something called a rotary spader, or I guess they call it rotary spader, but there's a different style of spader that is more like a crankshaft style that kind of has some paddles that punch the crop down in. But mine's more like a big curved spade. It's just rotating slowly, and so you go through the field and incorporate it. But I've gone from several passes with the disc to 1 pass with the spader. So at least I'm saving fuel to some degree, I think, but it's still a lot of tillage. And so I'm now bringing livestock into the picture. So I'm grazing my cover crops with sheep, but I still haven't found the way to do it, because it's a long story, but the short story is I'm still learning and I don't know the answer.
Well, I don't want to get lost. We haven't heard from Darren yet, but I mean, all of these principles. And so I'm going to go back to the 5 or 6 soil health principles, just no disturbance, keep it covered, keep the rotations. You got cattle integration, and then obviously reduce the synthetics. And so we try to, that's what we're trying to incorporate with everything that we're doing. But I think I've heard the 6th soil health principle is context. And so I love to hear that you're struggling, because I think we all are. You mentioned, Patrick, that, the interseeding. We haven't heard your struggles yet, Darren, so we'll get to those. But I don't want whoever the audience is for this to lose sight of context. And everybody gets paralyzed with that and then just says it can't work. And so I'm excited about your tenacity with regard to the cover crop is the right thing to do. It's just figuring out how it's going to work in your system. So back to ours is just, we started no-till in 2013, thought we had solved the world, and quickly saw that we weren't getting any further with it. And, other than we weren't blowing anymore. I live 10 miles from town. I grew up, you couldn't see town half the year from the blowing dust, and that has now stopped. 75 to 80% of the farmers in this small area have gone no-till. So that's an exciting change. But, just with the help of those programs like CSP and EQIP, we thought, well, let's try cover crops. And then, again, in our context, we learned that the cover crop was cute, but it wasn't. What were we going to do with it? We terminated it, and it was using our 6 inches of rain. So that was where the cattle came in. In our case, somebody mentioned foliar. We now have been over the entire ranch and has not seen. We've been 2 years now because we're in a fallow system. Unfortunately, that's going to change in a hurry. But the entire rotation has not seen an introduced synthetic in the soil in 2 years.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to interject here, but I think, Doug, you hit, it's this, we talk about a lot from like soil balance, and so much of what we're doing from establishing our cover crop, which is really just weeds, we're really just trying to reduce soil temperatures, and we're really just trying to really think about all of this from building the soil biology and the soil biome. And so much of that solves so many other downstream problems. We used to do X and Y and Z. And now when we worry about and think about the soil being in balance, and we think about the biology of the soil and that it's so much more complex, and we understand that a lot of these problems kind of solve some of themselves. We're needing less nutrients, we're just needing less of everything in the soil and the plants, and the resiliency of the plants we're finding is just night and day difference as we think about soil biology. And to your point about kind of, it solves a lot of itself.
Well, maybe I better share my story from a wet perspective, I guess. So I've never, self-admittedly, I'm not a soil nutrient kind of carbon scientist guy. I read all about that. I understand it's important. We have, though, had a focus on kind of maintaining our organic matter over the years. In fact, I was just listening to everybody talking here. It reminded me of something my grandpa and my dad started when we raised winter wheat, and we can produce a lot of straw in this climate. Some of the winter wheat, soft white winter wheat varieties had really tall straw. In fact, they would lodge occasionally, and it was actually a commodity to bale off the field. And we were baling other products like vines left over from our green peas and green, like grass and hay. But what I'm getting at is we actually stopped. We recognized we needed that straw incorporated back into the soil to help us just basically be able to farm it without having so many clods and letting water and air build up and kind of get that. My grandpa used to call it humus. I think we call it organic matter now. And so, so that's kind of when our focus on organic matter started. And we have a pretty high organic matter soils in this area, not extremely high. We do have some in the 5 to 8%, but most of it's around 3.5 to 4. But overall, lately, our focus has been on trying to save fuel. We're a little bit selfish because we have tillage practices that we have to do to prepare a field for potatoes and some of these other vegetables. It's when the day comes, we can figure out how to farm like they do, like Doug's doing, no-till or minimum till and all that kind of thing. And believe me, we want to really bad, but right now we're having to prepare our soils. We have to do some tillage. So we're trying to find ways with cover crops to keep us from we can reduce our tillage practices by adding cover crops that have real fibrous roots that break down over winter, or actually in the spring when we work the ground, and then the soil would fall apart easier. So something like that. It's a little bit of a simple term. There's probably a little more scientific for that. But I too use a spader to invert and kind of to plow down, if you will, the cover crops. We have sort of gone away from a moldboard plow to the choice of using the spader, and it's I think Brad was trying to explain how it works. You guys can look it up on YouTube or whatever, but it's essentially like if you stuck a shovel straight down into the ground, or a spade, and then lifted and turned it over, and it incorporates about 16 inches deep or a little less, depending on how you have it set. So it's really good. Yeah, so we know about carbon. We want more carbon, mostly because we want to build up our organic matter so that our soil is easier to work and less fuel and then less inputs.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, I guess my suspicions were confirmed a little bit with that question about managing carbon and how, obviously, like we talked about, it's a complex thing, and a lot of people kind of come to the table thinking about carbon in different ways. I think it might be safe to say from the comments that a lot of it is you're thinking about managing your operation and keeping those principles applied that Doug mentioned. That fundamental goal, of course, you're not coming to the table thinking about how am I going to get more carbon into my soil, right? That's kind of almost an indirect thing. Patrick mentioned, taking care of some things, and some of these other pieces might take care of themselves. And I think that's a common theme that we hear with the growers that are doing really innovative things and kind of pushing the bout a little bit and trying to, get closer and closer to that quote unquote perfect system that you're all, talking about, still learning and still on that learning curve, which is great. But I'm wondering if you can just, if you've got, I don't know if we need to go around the horn for this, but just like if you've got things, maybe a few more examples of that, or, those could be positive consequences or they could be negative consequences. Where I came from, most recently from Ohio, a lot of new cover croppers would talk about, these good things that would happen, but then there would be things like slugs or voles that would be really challenging to manage. And I'm just wondering if you can pull an anecdotal story or something that, where you have since you switched a piece of your operation, how it's impacted either for the better or for the worse, some things. And, I don't know if that's a clear story or a clear question, but hopefully you get the point of where I'm going with this. It's kind of interesting to think of these like domino effects, where you might, pull one lever and several other levers either need to be, they can be ignored, or you might need to deal with something new. So I don't know if anyone's got a story that they're interested in sharing with us about along those lines. Yeah.
First of all, I love I love what Patrick keeps saying, and he keeps calling him a weed. I'll challenge you, and I didn't come up with this. You'll find that I'm the world's greatest plagiarist in the entire world. that weeds aren't weeds; they're just a misplaced plant or a mistimed plant. and so, interestingly enough, much to the chagrin of the neighbors, it doesn't appease the coffee shop, but we've kind of become a believer in that too. And one of the things we're learning is how do you manage that weed? Letting it go to seed is obviously a problem, but we're finding that we can maintain moisture in some of these fallows by letting the weeds get to a point, and it actually draws moisture. There's a respiration, there's all that going on. And so I love what you're doing, Patrick. We're trying to do that on our scale too, in a drier environment without that. I've got a great story. My wife and I like to do our Sunday tour, and we were driving around looking at a cover crop. I had a cover crop on a field that was getting eaten alive by goat grass. And so in a monoculture wheat crop, of course, our only solution is to either come with a broadleaf, which is where the canola fits in, or we have some sort of spray that is the spray of the day that's going to take the goat grass out of the wheat. And so as on our journey to get rid of all these chemicals, we had a cover crop on this field and grazed it and then let the cover crop come back. And one day we were out walking through it, and I expected to see a lot of goat grass. And as we walked through that, my wife and I, the goat grass had it had grown, but it had shriveled up. And so instead of a head with 20 or 30 or however many seeds a goat grass has, there was one, maybe two that were just all wilted over. And so my first inclination was to think, well, it had choked the goat grass out. But a lot of research and a lot of people telling that story, they really believed that the cover crop, the soil biology looked at that cover crop and said, hey, goat grass, we don't need you anymore. And it it was the first time that I thought, wow, we can really move the needle in a hurry with just planting some seeds. And that's where we're at again in our context. What seeds will that require to manage the weeds we have, or not a weed, it's a misplaced plant.
Yeah, I had a winemaker out, and I was lamenting the weeds. The aesthetics is different. Wine grapes are a little different in that our end customers physically out in the vineyard, during harvest once a week, looking at the vineyard. So aesthetics, we don't want a farm to look pretty, but it does matter to our customers and our winemakers because they're buying the grapes, making a product and selling it. So they need that story. And I was lamenting, kind of trying to sell the fact, hey, we're transitioning to this new system and they're no longer weeds. We want them. And he said, a weed is just a plant without anything around it. So grow some more weeds around it and you won't think of it as a weed any longer. But to your point about the sort of downstream impacts and seeing that to your goat grass story is, we used to always fight, even when we used herbicide 10 years ago, we'd always fight kochia coming up, and it would grow in the vine row where it get water really tall and shade the canopy, shade the fruit zone, and become these massive weeds. And when we transitioned to this floor to floor cover, we battled kochia for about a year and then no more. We haven't seen kochia. It's no longer a problem. And so it just sort of, again, whether it's, I chalked it up to choking out, being the other grasses and things we're letting grow, choking it out, but maybe it's the soil biology, to your point, Doug, about, we don't need you anymore. And to that, but to Steve, to your kind of question, I think, the voles that you mentioned from Ohio is, that's something we're concerned with, is kind of rodents and mice and girdling vines, something, how do we kind of manage that? How do we get that, cover crop in vine row cover crop back down again with a permanent crop going into winter, something we have not solved for yet. We haven't seen a lot of problem, but something we're concerned with. And then we're also, and it's unclear exactly, but we're really starting to do some experiments, starting to think about how does this cover crop, if the in vine row cover crop that we're growing, and one of the primary objectives of that is reducing soil temperatures in the peak of the day, so we don't just have bare soil and the top 2 inches of that soil being so hot. That's great. That's helping soil biology. How's that impacting wine quality and the wine style that our winemakers are making? Because that radiant heat that comes back up from the floor, all of those things impact the wine style. And so my brother, who's our winemaker, raised the question, and it was something that I hadn't thought about at all. I said, I'm solving for soil biology and soil health and plant resilience. And he said, those are all great things. What are we doing about wine quality? Is this going to positively impact wine quality, negatively impact wine quality? Do we have to do different canopy management practices to get to that same level of heat and phenolics that are actually directly impacting the type of wine and the style of wine that we're making from that block? And are we changing that block's, characteristics of the wine that comes out of that? And that's something we definitely don't have an answer for, but something we're starting to think about. How do we play with that? My only point with this is there's a lot of dominoes and downstream effects, and it's a very complicated matrix that we're dealing with. And it's, as all things in farming, there's not very much that's linear about it.
That's fantastic points. Yeah.
Well, I have a little story I could tell. I guess it was kind of unintended consequences of a cover crop. It was a annual rye, tetraploid annual rye, so not a cereal rye, but. And we got some new soil scientists on board here at WSU out at Mount Vernon, and I was eager to show them what we were doing out in our field and what we could find. And sometimes you can just sit and talk about this like we are right now, but other times when you just go for a little walk, it's amazing what you see and you get to talk about and just pick up things. And so I had my shovel with me, and we're kind of going for what the soil looks like, what roots look like, and what we could see, and we didn't really know what we were going to discover. And I took the first scoop of dirt, soil, and inverted over this grass. And the first thing we all saw was a wireworm. And so some of these crops can express certain pests, I guess, even like some of the soil diseases. I think I'm not sure about verticillium, but even things like pythium and things. So in a high intensity or kind of a very diverse vegetable farm, that's one thing that's kind of got my attention now. I have to kind of start screening some of these cover crops for that. And so I haven't haven't got the answers yet, but I'm learning more and more that it's not just pick one or pick many, and go with the most available that you can put on at one time. It's kind of thinking me, I got thinking back, I need to really choose carefully now because I don't want to create a new problem.
Brad, you want to share anything, or you got it?
Yeah, I was thinking of things like, so in my crop rotation, because I use a lot of cover crops, but I also grow crops like onions that need a fairly fine seed bed to get a stand, because you're dealing with a very small seed. And if you don't have good seed to soil contact, you will not get germination. And so that's been a struggle. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we still grow cover crops, but how do we also then get the seed bed to a fine enough point that we can have that good seed to soil contact that we need? And that one I haven't totally figured out, because let's say I grow onions in partnership with another guy, and he's also organic, and he's come up with a way to leave to reduce the tillage, leave more of the cover crop kind of standing in the field. So instead of in the fall before the onions, where I would come in and flail chop and spade in my mustard, he's flail chopping and then strip tilling that mustard in, and basically only tilling where the onions will be planted, and the rest of the field is left with that standing mustard stubble, which helps. He actually farms out near Royal City more, besides farming with me. And the Royal City area, sandy soils and a lot of wind in the spring, so they can have a serious amount of wind erosion. So that's kind of why he started doing that whole strip tilling thing. And we're still trying to fine tune it on my soil, because I have heavier soil, and all that residue, like not really incorporating it like I do with the spader. And I tried to do a little bit reduced tillage. Like I would only do the spader in the fall, and then in the spring we'd do, he just has something, a seed bed maker. I don't know. It's like a chisel chopper with a packer. Anyway, it still leaves quite a bit of residue up on top. It's not like a moldboard plow coming through and just really inverting that soil and leaving just a very fine soil particle up on top. So there are a lot of different ways to get the seed bed. And what we're trying to figure out is how to get the seed bed we need with the least amount of tillage possible. And the strip tiller is the way that he has gone about it. And we've tried it on my farm. He's found success out in the sands, and he's done a really good job of getting, well, I think he struggled, but I think he's getting it figured out. On my farm, we haven't gotten the stands yet. So we've done little fields, and we're still in the little field cycle because we don't want to plant the entire field and have a failure. So we're getting there, but it's, if you have a lot of residue from your cover crops and you're planting fine, small seeded crops, that's a challenge. You got to deal with that residue somehow.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So again, it's interesting to think about. For every action, there's some effects and direct effects and indirect effects, and the connectedness of these systems. Yeah. I want to go back to a point that Brad had kind of brought up earlier when we were talking a little bit about carbon, and that's that of nitrogen. We all can appreciate that organic matter is both carbon and nitrogen, and when we're burning organic matter, mineralizing that helps feed the crops. That was part of the sod busting era that made crops so productive, and then not so much after, say, 10 years or so. And I think it's important, maybe outside of the ag community, not really appreciated fact that when you're building carbon, you also, that costs money. If you want to build your organic matter, it costs money because it requires nitrogen to store carbon, right? And so the nitrogen's got to come from someplace. It's got to come from cover crops, or from maybe some additional fertilizer, or from additional nitrogen efficiency. So maybe the system gets a little bit tighter. But something's got to change for carbon to get into that system, into the soil. And I'm just curious if, you know, as you all are on different roads or your journey here for your operation, have you had issues in terms of kind of adjusting your nitrogen? I don't want to say issues, but have you had to tweak your nitrogen management program or your strategy to ensure that, you know, presumably as your soils are building with organic matter, maintaining that kind of those higher, maybe higher than average levels relative to, say, your neighbors? Have you had issues with like managing nitrogen or just trying to get enough nitrogen or build nitrogen? Doug, you look like you're ready to go with that one.
Everybody knows, anybody knows me knows I won't shut up. So, you know, so on the side, one of the things that this farm has had, we've had biosolids applied here since 1990, comes from a number of generators across the state. And with that is we have the longest running biosolid test plots in the nation. And so we could spend hours on biosolids and the pluses and minuses and so on and so forth. But what I've focused in on in the last 4 or 5 years is the control versus the commercial fertilizer. And so you know, and I hopefully I won't offend anybody or whatever else, but we've been conditioned to think we've got to have an input, that the soil test says there's no nitrogen and we've got to put some in. And since 1994, the commercial fertilizer strip has never paid for itself, ever. There's no cooking the numbers. That's just what it shows. And so that got us thinking, you know. And so we put in, we've been variable rating our fertilizer on zones throughout the field since, or through the farm since 14. Those zones that we quit putting nitrogen actually became more productive. And so all of this input's coming in, and then the research and some of the people that we follow began to tell us, you know, the soil really does have plenty of nutrients. And I'm a believer of that 100%. And so we run some total digestion tests, and it's fascinating what those tests show in what supposedly is a depleted soil. Has plenty of nitrogen, has plenty of phos, has plenty of everything. It's just we have so hosed up, or in my case, I'm not going to speak about anybody else. On my farm, we have, you know, we continue to put nitrogen in that seed zone, which hoses up in my opinion, not in my opinion, but what I believe, hoses up that biological relationship between the plant and the soil biology. And so once we stopped doing that, it went the other way, even though that our research probably continues to tell us it shouldn't. On our farm, it has. And so we've kind of gone the other way. Again, as I mentioned, we have no soil applied over the last 2 years, any soil applied nitrogen, phosphorus, anything in row, anything that we do from a fertility standpoint with regard to synthetics comes through the plant and through a foliar system. So I get accused of having a tin hat, but that's, you know, we're following those guidelines, and it's working. You know, if we saw that it wasn't working, we'd look somewhere else. And that, again, back to context, all of us, this is what's so fun about today. Everybody has their context, and we're all saying the same thing, that whether it's 30 inches of rain or R6, it's funny that 3 of us on the panel have 6 inches of rain. Everything we're trying is working, and we're trying to make it work, and we're seeing those results when people say that it shouldn't be working. So
when I started growing potatoes, if I were to have just based my decisions for nitrogen off of the soil test, I would have wasted so much money on importing nitrogen. And I started to see that, like, even in say, like, you start taking petioles and the numbers look really low, and you're like, why do these potatoes look so good? The numbers aren't making sense. And I would say that's one thing that probably steered me away from, or kind of like transition to only growing cover crops for the nitrogen, and then also just not worrying that much about soil testing. I mean, I still soil test, but I sure don't have heartburn about a soil test that comes back low, and where if you looked at the numbers, you'd be just like you'd be having nightmares, like, oh, my crop is going to shrivel up and die. It doesn't look good at all. And then you look at the crop and you produce a good crop, good yields, comparable to the crops around you where they're just pouring the nitrogen to the crop. So that's been a big learning experience for me. And like Doug, you said, you're doing like the digestion studies. Like we do mineralizable nitrogen incubations to try to help us figure out, okay, what's really in the soil, and that's been helpful. But even I've stopped doing that. Pretty much now, I just know that if I grow a really good cover crop or 2 successive cover crops, I don't need to worry about the following cash crop. It's just gonna be fine. And even if the soil test says it's not gonna be fine, it's gonna be fine.
Brad, let me just ask, we'll give it to the others if they're not jumping in right now, but just curious about, just also begs the question about what do you look to know, for feedback for what you're doing? Obviously the crop is a big indicator, right? Of if you're growing a good crop and if it's making money. But you mentioned soil testing and thinking about, maybe that they're not really calibrated, or those, the recommendations weren't built for a system, or aren't calibrated for, say, a system like you've got. And so I'm just curious, like, are there other things you look to kind of help inform your decision, and quote unquote, if it's working or if it's not? There's a lot of questions in there. I mean, the question like, do we need more tests or different tests, or kind of a test in the context of an organic system versus a conventional system? I mean, I'm just curious about if you've got thoughts about that. What do you use to guide your management if it's not going to be a traditional soil test? Yeah.
This is probably going to sound strange, but I use my gut a lot. And I don't even know how to describe it to somebody. I think it's frustrating to people that like numbers and they like, what does the soil test say, or what does the petiole sample say? And I think they can sometimes think, man, Brad's just winging it, but honestly, a lot of my decisions are just, I don't know how to describe it. It's just a gut feeling. And that's where sometimes farming becomes like a spiritual experience. It's like just trusting the system and don't try to outguess it, type of thing. But I'm being encouraged to try SAP analysis, and I've tried SAP analysis, but trying to make sense of those reports, I mean, honestly, you need help to try to figure it all out, and everybody has their take on what you're supposed to be looking at. I don't know. I get completely overwhelmed and confused fairly easily because I feel like I'm a pretty simple person, and my wife, she grew up Mennonite, and in the Mennonite church, there's a lot of simplicity, and they talk about more with less. That's like a theme that in their religion, and I feel like that's the way I've become as a farmer, like more with less. And I can't explain it. And I don't even know why I'm getting emotional.
No, it's great. Who wants to follow that up?
Oh man,
That's a tough act to follow.
We're also using SAP, but Brad mentioned he's gone away from the soil test and has moved to SAP, and that you can tell just emotionally he's going to move past that in a hurry too. We're using SAP as a transition tool because we're moving out of a degraded system and trying to get into the good, a system that's going to work economically better for us. And so we found the SAP very interesting, if anything. And again, it confirmed that there's plenty of nitrogen. I have not taken one SAP test yet that said I was low in nitrogen. It talked about molybdenum and manganese and magnesium and some of these others, but we're able to then tie that back to the fact that we're heavily bacterial dominated right now. Well, those are the things that are going to be limited when you're solid bacteria and have no fungal. So, I think, again, I continue to look at Brad right now just because you came out of a wheat fallow system. You had the cover crops, you're making them work, and you've moved past all of this. That's why you should get emotional. I'm envious of what you've done and the observations you've already made. But that, again, I consider SAP to be just transitionary for now. there will be a day where there aren't any tests, and quite honestly, there's not a lot of big equipment around here. I just put in our fallow wheat, this wheat on wheat fallow dry land system. You know, I don't know where 50 bushel wheat supports a $500,000 or $1 million combine anymore. That just seems to be a broken system. And so one of our last jokes is, you know, if I blow a tire on a combine, it's $5,000. If I blow a tire on a cow, we eat it. And so that seems to make economic sense to me.
Well, this is fascinating as far as dry land and all that, but a little bit on, you know, we grow a lot of biomass. Just the climate is conducive to that. The soil's rich already. My focus was always incorporate all of the leftover plant mass that we can, you know, in order to build up the soil. But it does require a lot of nitrogen. In fact, one of the practices, getting back to kind of what my dad and the standard practice is to put 100 pounds of nitrogen on after you work in your wheat stubble, or to work in your wheat stubble. So we started raising a legume, fava beans. I've tried a little bit of that vetch. I haven't mastered that. I'll continue to play with that, and I'm going to play with some winter peas, but the fava beans overwinter really well here. And there's a lot of questions to be answered about how fava beans or any legume fix nitrogen in a cool, wet soil over winter, if the bacteria is there and all that. But what we did notice was some real visual impacts. It's a real simplistic way to look at things, even though we do soil tests. And we had 80 acres of field corn planted. About half of that had the cover crop where the fava beans were, and the other half was coming out of grain without any of that. And it's maybe not a total apples to apples, but where the legume, where the fava bean was turned down, it was much greener and about, I don't know, 4 inches taller most of the year. So we have to get that figured out scientifically, you know, quantify it somehow. But kind of like Brad, we saw that you see these things and you just trust your gut on what's working and what's not working. But adding a little bit of diversity with a legume for me was something that we've seen real positive things happen.
You know, some of the tests that are out there, right? I think it's important to think about that, you know, soil tests or sap tests or petiole tests, that's done relatively consistently in the lab, and there's kind of, you know, methods outlined in protocols and whatnot. What happens is the number that you get back might, going back to what you've been harping on, Doug, is, you know, might be different in the context, right? So a pH number, of course, we have to understand what the soil is and what we're growing. And I'm just curious, like maybe going back to that question is like, you know, Brad or Doug or whoever, like if you're getting, say you're still getting soil tests and they're recommending you putting nitrogen on, I'm wondering if you've like kind of got your own range, you know, in other words, the number is still valuable, but the recommendation is less important, right? That comes with that test. Or I'm wondering if anyone's like, if I'm just kind of fishing around here, or if this is resonating with anyone in terms of like, as your system has become more optimized or changed and you feel more comfortable with it, have you kind of created your own recommendations based on any of the tests or any of the things that you use? Just getting back to this question of like, where do you get your information to help guide your management, what to do next? Yeah.
We've just had to relearn what those numbers mean. And I think, you know, they come back from the lab and you get your number and it's on a nice, you know, red or green bar chart and it says this, and really taking the context of what that means and that understanding that not all farms, not all soils, there is no one standard thing. And so you need to learn. And I don't think it's very scalable. I think it's to Brad's gut feeling comment. I think every farmer goes a lot. I mean, obviously we all want data. We want to make repeatable. We want to make decisions based on data so they're as repeatable as possible and we can work towards incremental improvement from that. But there's a lot of this for us in looking, and we run soil samples still. We do petiole samples. We're looking at sap flow. I mean, we're looking at all of the things, you but it's the context for each individual site. And our 400 acres of grapes is spread out across, 10 different sites. It's not all contiguous, or 12 different sites now. It's not all contiguous, and each site's a little different. It's understanding the context in which they're operating and what the goal is. And I think this, what's for us, what's vine health, what's plant health look like, what's long-term productivity, and sort of melding together the plant health numbers, nutrient levels with your productivity. I mean, it's a little different for grapes perspective, because I'm able to look at the productivity from this vine. This literally is the same plant that's been in the ground for 25 years. So we're able to look at that. We're not replanting. There's less variables in that than planting row crops of some kind. But I think it's to your point about the context. And I think everyone needs to kind of relearn those numbers. And I think, to me, where we are from a research perspective, and I'm by no means a scientist, I'm just a farmer, is I think the awesome amount of soil research that's taken place in the last 10 or 15 years has really just taught me all the things that we don't know. We now know what we don't know. And 15 years ago, we didn't realize what we didn't know. And talking about soil biology and talking about soil resiliency and plant resiliency, and all of these things are connected. And there's a whole lot of things to learn on that front. And farmers, operators are needing to do that kind of themselves in real time and figure out what data points mean something on their particular farm and their particular system and their particular crop.
I had that data 6-7 years ago with regard to that biosolid test plot that showed me that the commercial never beat the control since 1994. It didn't slow me down from putting nitrogen in the soil up to a couple of years ago. And so a lot of this stuff is done because, that's the way grandpa did it, the way dad did it, the way the industry does it. And that's how we sleep at night. And so I think Brad got emotional because there's a lot of stress that comes with trusting your gut. I mean, I remember when I first came back, it was easy to just get the soil test put on the 50 pounds or whatever we could afford when it was all said and done. And I could go to bed or go to the lake or whatever else, and that just went on. But this journey here, just as you just mentioned, Patrick, for gosh sakes, we don't know. We've moved from a chemistry approach to agriculture to a biological, and all of a sudden they're telling us that there's more biology in a teaspoon than there is on the face of the earth. And so our minds immediately want to go to, how am I going to manage that? And so we're attempting, whether we have our wrecks just like everybody else, but we're trying to work inside of that system as opposed to imposing our will.
I'd either like to hear, I've been sitting here debating what I was going to end on in terms of the questions, but I'd either like to hear just kind of, something that you're really excited about and implementing on your operation next, kind of a very specific piece, like that might be, or just a question that I haven't asked that you want to share, anything that you want to kind of just sum up with, because we'll be wrapping up here soon. So I'll leave that at Darren. How about I'll pick on you and say, do you have anything you want to?
Well, I'm just looking ahead at trying new technologies, maybe inter row cropping. On our grass seed fields, we actually grow them in a row. They're drilled in on about a 16-inch spacing. So there's a little bit of room in there to play with. Right now we control the weeds with an herbicide, and wanting to find a crop that would grow in there that would have like an allelopathic effect, something like a mustard maybe, or a radish or something like that would winter kill. We don't have a hard enough winter sometimes, so it might end up being a weed. Have to learn how to handle that. I might have to mow it or something, but there's that. I'm excited about what we're doing in the soil. Starting to see some positive things. The soil's smelling good. It's looking better than it did. We still have a lot of challenges to overcome, but I'm grateful to be a part of this community and learn and engage and try to do our part and what we can do.
Thanks for that. That's great.
I don't know if it affects anyone else. Probably one of my final thoughts would be, 95% leased. I have 12 different landlords in my case. Obviously, in dryland farming, we're a little bit broad acre with regard to that. But they're part of the transition in the journey. And I know, I don't know who the audience is going to be of this, but if they're in the room going, man, this is where I got to be, but the landlord. I just encourage everybody to take that on and just ask them to join the journey. I think you'll be surprised. In our case, we held a landlord day, and it was kind of a double-edged sword. Everybody kind of bought in, and then I ended up with all these soil health experts, because landlords tend to have a little bit more time to research than I do. So they've actually moved the needle because they're invested. And then probably the final thing is I see one of your questions was crop insurance. Again, not knowing who your audience is going to be. I think crop insurance was not designed for nature, in my opinion. And so in my case, we've just gone away from the cash crop, and I just certify that it's a forage grazing. And in my case, my wife happens to be my crop insurance agent. So my joke has always been, I'm going to try to put her out of business because I don't need her anymore. Not as a wife, but as my crop insurance agent.
I was thinking about, so with getting this water from the Columbia River, and I'll have basically full water on all the acres, the amount of things I can do as far as cover cropping. They talk about keeping something on the ground all the time, green and growing. I haven't been able to do that because I have more acres that I'm trying to farm that I actually have enough water for. So I have these fallow periods, and Doug has to deal with the fact he has to summer fallow. And so you don't have a lot of options sometimes if you're low on rainfall or even irrigation water, if you're light on water. So taking those fallow periods out of the system, I think will be fun to watch how that works. Like being able to have summer cover crops that cover that ground, and then maybe more grazing, and maybe I'll figure this all out. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, it'll be exciting to see how it comes how it all works out with more water. I think it'll be a good thing for the ground.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm most excited about, I guess, two fronts. On a very tactical level, the technology we're deploying on our farm, like actual sensors and the investments we're making on that, and the direction that's going, and being able to measure real-time soil sort of carbon. I mean, there's just so much going on in the big bucket ag tech space. I think that's going to be a real watershed moment. I think we're reaching that tipping point, and the way we all farm and the rubric which we make decisions on all farms 10 years from now is just going to look a whole lot different, because the amount of data we're going to have, and we're going to be assisted. I think we're all on a point now, technology, where we're using, we're getting back to where we started with soil tests, and we're getting real-time soil moisture, and we're getting all these things. And it's almost too much data. It's all having to synthesize into our heads. And then it comes out as this gut feeling, to Brad's point, right? And as we get technology and we can start to measure these things and measure all this stuff, and we start to get some, machine learning models on this, I think I'm really excited sort of about that in general. And I think it's going to help us understand soil health and what that means, and how soil health is connected to plant health and plant productivity. And then the sort of other place my brain went when we asked the question was, I think we're also, as farmers at large, not everybody, but I think in general, there's more, the preponderance of people are there, and that understanding that like the systems is not problem A applied product B, which creates these downstream effects. As we're all to this point as an industry, we're realizing we've created ecosystems, natural or not, and we're managing on this big picture scale. And it's no longer the chemical guy coming around saying, oh, you got this problem, apply this product, without any thought process about what the downstream impacts or unintended consequences are going to be. And we need to understand that there are, and we're to a point that we're understanding, we being farmers, are managing for the problem at hand and also the unintended downstream consequences of those. And so we're thinking about our farms in a more holistic way. Agricultural farmers are understanding that. And that's super exciting to me, because what we're going to do, what that means for our consumers, what that means for the quality of the products we grow, what that means for the quality and resiliency of the ground that we're all operating on. We're not making any more farm ground around the world. What we have is what we have, and it's on us to maintain that for future generations to, for future generations, not only to operate, but to feed the world. And I think we're at this really interesting tipping point where we've come to this point where we understand that big bucket at large. And that's really exciting for me.
We're out of time now, and we should, kind of wrap things up here, but I just want to, take the time and thank you all for joining. Thanks for, obviously these kind of panels are awesome because they're just, they do inspire, they inspire folks like me. I'm sure they do a tremendous amount to inspire other growers. So I just want to thanks for your time and for what you all do to, for the environment and for feeding folks. So, any last thoughts before we wrap up? Final words?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank
Great.
you.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to checking in with you maybe in a few years. And Brad, you can tell us all about that new water, and you can give us an update. Everyone else can give us an update where you're at on the journey. Okay.
All right, we can have a pool party at the pond. I'm gonna have a big pond.
Wonderful.